Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name's Lisa Gavoni, and I work for the Planning Department on Housing Policy. I'm pleased to be here today to introduce our moderator and panelists for this session on one of my current favorite topics, the draft of Montgomery County's General Plan, Thrive Montgomery 2050. Today, we'll talk about how we envision using it to achieve one of our housing goals laid out in the plan to build more missing middle housing in Montgomery County. Casey Anderson will serve as our moderator today. Casey Anderson has served on the Montgomery County Planning Board since 2011 and was appointed chair in 2014. He also serves as the vice chair of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, the bi-county agency established by state law that regulates real estate development, plans, transportation infrastructure, and manages the park system in Montgomery and Prince George's County. Casey has championed a number of award-winning planning concepts that capitalize on green space and improvements for walking, biking, and transit, as well as strengthening economic development and competitiveness. Before he was named chair of the planning board, Anderson founded a jury consulting firm after working as a congressional staffer, government relations executive, newspaper reporter, and lawyer in private practice. He has served on boards of numerous nonprofit organizations. Now let's introduce our panelists. Councilmember Will Jawando attended Catholic University, where he started its first NAACP chapter. Later in his career, he worked with House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, Senator Sherrod Brown, and then Senator Barack Obama. During the Obama administrations, Will Jawando served as Associate Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement and as an advisor to U.S. Secretary of Education Duncan. Prior to his election as an at-large Montgomery County Council member in 2018, Will Jawando founded Our Voices Matter Maryland, a social justice nonprofit that works with all communities to develop broader civic engagement, grassroots activism, and leadership. He also spearheaded Summer Rise, a summer job shadowing program in partnership with WorkSource Montgomery, state and county government, and Montgomery County Public Schools. Michelle Winters joined Alliance for Housing Solutions as Executive Director in May 2016. She previously served as Senior Visiting Fellow for Housing at the Urban Land Institute's Redinger Center for Housing. Michelle also led capacity building initiatives in sustainable communities and affordable housing preservation for NeighborWorks America and the Local Initiative Support Corporation, two of the country's largest affordable housing organizations. Michelle worked on housing policy issues for 9 years at Fannie Mae and the Fannie Mae Foundation. She served on Arlington's Housing Commission, chairing the Bricks and Mortar Committee and serving as commission chair in 2008. Sarah Reddinger is the Vice President of Community Development for Habitat Metro Maryland that oversees advocacy, family service and lending, community development, and strategic partnerships, while also playing a critical role in the real estate acquisition and project management. Sarah began her career at an AIDS clinic before becoming a banking analyst. Under her leadership, Sarah has grown Habitat Metro Maryland's new and rehab project pipeline nearly tenfold and its repair and weatherization program threefold. She launched an aging in place program and a veteran repair program to assist residents in their abilities to remain in their homes long-term so that their wealth can be transferred to the next generation and break the cycle of poverty. Committed to breaking down barriers to home ownership, she also sits on the executive committee of the Montgomery Housing Alliance and serves on the Montgomery Planning Department's Housing Equity Advisory Team. Welcome, panelists and moderator, and let's get this presentation going. So I'm going to share my screen.
Thanks for that introduction, Lisa. I'll just wait for you to fire up the PowerPoint and then we'll get right into it. And while we're doing that, I just want to thank everybody for joining the panel. And it's great to have all of our panelists here, particularly our elected representative from the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee, Will Jawando, who is the leading sponsor of missing middle housing legislation in the county. So great to be here with all of you. You can go ahead and advance one slide. I think this is a pretty sophisticated audience, so I won't go into a lot of explanation about what a general plan is. We're updating ours, and as many of you may know, the plan that was developed in 1964 called the Wedges and Corridors Plan is well known not just in this area, but in the planning profession as a seminal document in land use and transportation planning. It had a lot of progressive ideas, particularly considering it was written in 1964, before phrases like transit-oriented development or walkable urbanism were even coined. It set the stage for many really good ideas, including the idea that Montgomery County should be focused on affordable housing, which ultimately led several years later to the passage of the inclusionary zoning ordinance, also known in Montgomery County as the moderate price dwelling unit law. It identified the need to figure out how to align the provision of public infrastructure like water and sewer, roads, schools with development, and that created an early version of the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, which we call the growth policy. And it also spotlighted the need to protect farmland, which even then everybody was aware that it was getting chewed up quickly as Montgomery County had already become a bedroom community of Washington, D.C. by that point. And that led to creation of the Agricultural Reserve, which also has won national awards for its forward thinking. So we have a high bar to write a new general plan that is similarly visionary and anticipates the needs of the future, as well as figuring out how to adapt to some of the things that are confronting us today. Next slide. We've identified 3 objectives that weren't discussed much, if at all, in 1964. Economic competitiveness. In 1964, we could pretty much take it for granted in Montgomery County that all we had to do was answer the phone, and developers, employers, residents would be wanting to come to Montgomery County, build things, live here, start businesses. That's no longer the case. We have to compete for our share of economic opportunities and jobs. The phrase racial equity does not appear in the 1964 plan, despite the fact that that was obviously a period with a lot of activity. In fact, the March on Washington occurred shortly before just a few months before the general plan was adopted, and yet that was not mentioned in the 64 plan. And environmental resilience was identified as a concern. There was some discussion of things like water and air quality and preserving green space, but nothing like the degree of concern that has been raised over the last several years about climate change. So these are 3 pillars of this plan that were not really the focus, or at least not nearly to the same degree as they were in 1964. Next slide. I want to talk specifically today about affordable attainable housing because that's what we're talking about at the conference, but I want to point out for anybody who's interested, there are about a dozen or more really important, interesting ideas in this plan other than housing. And to be honest with you, it's a little disappointing that everybody's so fixated on missing middle housing in the context of this plan, because I think there's so much else here that's important. But since I'm here with a crowd of housing enthusiasts, we're going to talk just about affordable and attainable housing, in particular about missing middle. Next slide. One of the most interesting things I've learned in the last couple of years working on this plan is that households are just very different today than they were in 1960. I hadn't really given this a lot of thought, honestly, before the last couple of years. What this chart shows is that in 1960, 60% of the households in Montgomery County consisted of a married couple with school-age children living at home. And today that proportion is 26%. So less than half the proportion of households consists of that leave it to beaver model of a married couple with kids of school age living at home. By contrast, in 1960, 7% of households in the county consisted of a single person living by themselves. By 2018, that was 25%, so 3.5 times the proportion. Obviously, there's a lot of social and economic factors behind those changes, and they have a lot of implications. But for housing, which is our topic today, the point I want to make is we have not changed our land use regulatory assumptions at all based on this kind of household change. This by itself is a reason to reconsider fundamental questions about how land in Montgomery County and other places like it is zoned. Next slide. As households are getting smaller, houses are getting bigger. So even as we get more and more single person households, fewer and fewer family households, the single family houses have more than doubled in size. And you see that chart right there. It's gone from about 1,500 square feet in the 50s to new single family houses over the last 10 years have been over 3,700 square feet. So that's quite striking that the direction of the size of houses is going the opposite direction of the size of households. Next slide. It's probably not surprising that since we're not providing a lot of land for anything other than single family houses, and houses are getting bigger, but there's not a lot more accommodation for multifamily, that a lot of renter households are overcrowded. And you see in this table the number of households that include more people than bedrooms in rental units. Next slide. Meanwhile, as those houses are getting bigger, yet the houses are getting smaller, you're finding a lot of owned units. And of course, that can include multifamily, you can have some condominiums, but in general, we're talking about single family houses, especially single family detached houses. You see there's thousands of families in, or thousands of households in Montgomery County where there are 2 or 3 more bedrooms than there are people in the house. And of course, some people want to have a home office or want to have a spare bedroom for visitors when the kids are home from college. But I think it's safe to say that when you got 1 or 2 people living in a 5-bedroom house, at least a few of those households probably would find that there's another housing type that's a little bit more closely aligned with what their needs are at that particular point in their lives. Next slide. So how is it that households are getting smaller and the houses are getting bigger, and we've got so many underhoused renters and overhoused people in single family houses? I submit to you a big part of the reason is that we have set aside vast swaths of land for single family housing exclusively, and very little for multifamily housing. You can see this graph shows you the relative proportion, with over 1/3 of the county zoned for single family and just a little over 2% for multifamily housing. So that suggests there is a quite profound mismatch between the way that we've zoned land in the county and the types of housing that people need. And remember, that's just parking to one side for a minute the questions about affordability. This obviously has an effect on affordability. When you can't find a housing unit that suits your needs, there are implications that are driven by economics. But even if we didn't have to worry about what housing costs, we would have some serious questions to confront about whether or not the housing stock matches the way people are actually living their lives. Next slide. Obviously, homeownership is important, not just because people need to put a roof over their heads, but because it's one of the key ways in the United States that we provide a path to saving money, capital formation, being able to invest in the future and have something to either pass on to your kids, borrow against if you want to start a small business, or if you have a health crisis or some unforeseen financial problem. The ability to own your home is important for reasons separate even from the shelter that it provides. And yet in Montgomery County, we find that households at the medium household income can't afford the median home that's available for sale. Next slide. This has equity implications, both racial and socioeconomic. And this chart lays this out. I don't think I need to take this apart piece by piece. You can see the data for yourself that it shows that particularly African Americans, but also other people of color do not have the same rate of home ownership in the county, and they're overrepresented among renters. So not everybody wants to own a home or necessarily should own a home, but creating the opportunity for home ownership is a very important building block to creating a more equitable community. Next slide. And the size and type of house is very closely related to affordability. I often hear people say, well, if you have missing middle or these different housing types, you can't guarantee they'll all be affordable in the sense of that people who are in the affordable housing business talk about it, 60 to 80% of AMI or lower. The ability to deliver more units that are smaller and of different types of tenure, different types of structure, detached, attached, multiple units on the same lot, has a big influence on what the price is. And that's true at all points on the price spectrum. Next slide. So that's why the recommendations in Thrive Montgomery, very straightforward. We think that we should have more housing in the county of all kinds. Affordable, regulated, market rate, new housing, old housing, rental housing, ownership housing, condominiums, apartments, 2x2, 2/2s, cottage style units, duplexes, triplexes, quads, everything that you can, everything you can think of. We ought to at least try it. And I think that one of the key errors that I think people make is saying, well, X solution, whether it's missing middle or ADUs or more moderate price dwelling units or more heavily subsidized public housing, whatever it is, it's not going to solve the problem. And that's all true. The answer to the affordable housing problem, the attainable housing problem, is we need a little of everything, because no one solution will be sufficient to address the whole problem, because it is a big problem and we really are decades behind in trying to attack it with the kind of energy that's required for the task. Next slide. Missing middle is, however, an important piece of that. And I don't think I need to explain to this group what missing middle is, but this illustrates the concept. I think it's a great graphic and shows that it's everything between single family detached houses and high-rise apartment buildings. And there's lots of different permutations that are possible. I also see Jason Sartori, our crack leader of our functional planning team, has put in a link to the Thrive Montgomery plan if you'd like to check that out and see more detail on what the recommendations are all about. Next slide. And I think that might be it. At which point, I think I'm going to turn this over, I believe Sarah's first, is that correct?
Councilmember Jawando is first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Jawando, yes. I'd like to hand it over to you as our leading elected proponent of missing middle.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Anderson. And good to be with everybody. And good to see you, Ms. Simon. Happy Friday. And to Sarah and to Michelle and Brian. And in the background, the great team at planning that I know is in the wings. And to all the guests. You know, I appreciated Chair Anderson's presentation. I think it sets a good foundation. And I was scanning who's in this room as well. I think we've got a lot of pros in here who are in the audience. But just by way of background, I won't be too long because I think I'd like to get into the Q&A. I agree we need more housing for more people. And I introduced a set of proposals last year or early this, it all runs together in COVID. Forgive me, we just passed the budget yesterday. The straw vote will finally pass it, $6 billion budget next week. But the premise that I think undergirded the data that Casey showed and the disparities and the challenges we have with affordability and just with enough housing for people in general is that we do need an all hands on deck approach. We need different types of housing at different price points in all communities, particularly in areas where there are job centers near transit, where it's accessible for people to improve their quality of life and get to employment and to amenities and to their children, schools, if they have them, or if they're single, to get to work, to walk, to bike, to take public transit. And we need to do all of the above. And when you look at our median income, and you especially look at where we are in COVID, when we've just gone through one of the most inequitable pandemics, and now as we enter the recoveries that we've ever seen, really. And in that, you know, if you've heard the term the K-shaped recovery, you know, there's a national number that I use that is just staggering. 40% of Black businesses are gone within the last year. You know, a slightly lower but similar number for Latino owned. Women owned businesses. Women have left the workforces in droves to support their families and themselves. In the month of December of last year, 156,000 jobs were lost net. That was the net job loss. They were all women. Men actually gained 14,000 jobs that month. And so when you look, you look at who, and we know that women tend to have been the breadwinners in many households, particularly our families of color. When you add all that up in those businesses that are owned by people of color, hired people of color, they were helping people pay their rent and their mortgage. You add all that together, and then you layer on the health impacts of COVID that has disproportionately hit some of our most communities that have been hit hard in other ways. You really have, it exacerbates this need for housing, and many people are behind, right? We have this looming eviction crisis. Many people are behind on their mortgages. Many businesses are behind on their lease payments and rent payments for individuals. So you just add all this on, it makes this conversation even more urgent. It was urgent before the pandemic, but now it's the fire alarms are going off everywhere because people need, it's a basic human right to have a place to live that's affordable, safe, clean, where you can have an opportunity to take care of yourself and or your family, and have a good quality of life. And unfortunately, as we've developed over time, that's not the case. We know that that's not the case here. I've been here my whole life. That's never been the case. I grew up in a poorly maintained apartment in Long Branch. And I was able to move through the kind of step-up housing. We had our first duplex in Long Branch on 11th Avenue when I was 14 years old. You couldn't have told me, to Casey's point of the house sizes, it was 1,000 square feet. It was like a mansion to me. It was like an absolute mansion. And had multiple people that lived there, my stepdad, my mom, my stepdad's brother, my uncle, and myself, and we were fine. And I think this missing middle is a testament to the fact that, like much of our earlier time where this attainable housing and affordable housing strategy, we can do this. We have produced in the past types of housing that can house all folks at rates that are relatively affordable. And we have to get back to that by producing more housing, by also producing different types of housing. And I usually say the 3 Ps. I haven't coined this, but I try to lift it up. We need housing production, we need housing preservation of affordable, and we need protection of renters so that are in places now so that they can stay there. And I think we need that all of the above strategy. So when I introduced the More Housing for More People, which Chair Anderson referenced, it was this ZTA to get this conversation going in earnest. And it's been a conversation that planning, to their credit, and others have been having for a number of years. They've had a great missing middle website. They've done a ton of research about how do we bring this type of design and housing into the market to complement and to help us with our production and to produce housing at different price points. My proposals were tied to transit, but this is something we are ultimately going to need everywhere as we continue to build out our transit network, as we continue to push economic development across the county, places from White Flint to White Oak and everywhere in between, up to Gaithersburg and Germantown and the like. And so one was a missing middle proposal near transit that would allow, it was a form-based approach that will allow, when we take it up and we combine it with whatever else we're considering, it'll be part of that missing middle. I think now the planning department has rightly characterized it as this kind of small missing middle, right? There's different types. If you look at that map that Chair Anderson put up, it depends on where you are. If you're on a corridor on a busy street, you can have something bigger. If you're inside a neighborhood, you have more of a duplex, triplex model, but we're going to need all of that. But mine was targeted at within a mile of transit, that you would relax the zoning in a form-based way, that you could build missing middle housing in single family zones that was the same height and setback requirements, a little relaxing of the parking, just to put out there that this is something we need to do. And the details are fungible. We're going to have to figure out what's affordable, what actually will be produced by the market, what are the design guidelines, how do we ensure that we get what we want and we don't just get super expensive townhomes. I will say, I've said to folks, if you get that, you're at least getting 2 units near transit where you only had 1. It's still an improvement. But I think there are things that we can do. How do we help people like Habitat for Humanity and others who have done this type of housing get in the market and create truly affordable housing? So there's a lot of questions to answer that we're going to be working on this spring, summer, and fall. And then the other proposal, just quickly, was about protection for renters. And I think it's really important to this all of the above moment is that we talk about these things together. And I had proposed a anti-rent gouging proposal that near transit that would give some stability and consistency to folks that live in transit corridors, which have the highest rents because of their location, that they couldn't go up past a certain percentage. Again, fungible on what the percentage is. Is it new construction, old construction? I think like DC does, old construction might be probably the best idea. But how do we put together the right set of policies that are going to get us what we need, where we need to go? Again, that North Star of affordable, clean, accessible, quality housing for every resident in our county, in our state, in our nation. So I'm excited to be a part of this discussion. I look forward to the council. We're going to be taking this up and as part of Thrive, and then as part of a separate attainable housing strategy conversation, including my ZTA. It's 2007, and I'll put the links to that in the chat so that you can look it up. I'm sure everyone here already knows about it, but I'll do that anyway. And so I look forward to the conversation, but this is an important part of what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Jawando. Let's turn to Sarah Reddinger next. Did I get that right? Or are we doing Michelle first?
I think we were going to do Michelle.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Michelle,
at least you're consistently getting it a little out of order.
I'm just consistently wrong. Whatever I say, it's the wrong answer. I'm a leading contrary indicator. Michelle, take it away.
Great. Yes, and I had already unmuted myself, although otherwise I would have let that go. So hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Winters. As Lisa has said, I come from the Alliance for Housing Solutions, which is a nonprofit organization that is actually doing work in Arlington County and on the Virginia side of the river. And so what I'm here to talk to you about is to give you some examples of how another jurisdiction is tackling this issue. And I actually think you'll hear a lot of parallels, but there's some differences as well. So, you know, similar to Montgomery County, we've been talking about this in Arlington for many years. About 5 years ago, my organization held one of our annual forums, the Lucky Forum, where we had, you know, the big thinker on missing middle housing, Daniel Perolic, come in and give us a inspiring talk on missing middle housing. And everybody was excited. Not everybody, a lot of people were excited, but really didn't know where to start. So it actually took several years for us to, as a community, to wrap our heads around how to move anything forward. And we have finally started doing that. Now, my organization, AHS, is traditionally a sort of traditional affordable housing focused organization, but we embraced the missing middle housing concept for a number of reasons. The first that comes to mind for me personally is the geographic diversity and equity issues within a community, sort of recognizing the need to break through the monopoly that single family zoning has on a vast majority of our community. And the income and racial segregation that has caused. And missing middle housing appears to be one of a promising tool to try to break through that. We also need a greater housing supply across the board in our region at all different price points. And that need for housing supply, the gap that's been created through undersupply over the past several decades, has really caused affordability to be much bigger of a challenge than it really normally is. And so we need an all hands on deck kind of approach to getting enough housing supply. And again, missing middle housing is one of those strategies, although clearly not the only strategy in meeting those needs for housing supply. And then another issue that made this really important for us, and you know, Councilmember Jawando mentioned it, and Sarah's going to talk about it too, but I'll use the example of Habitat for Humanity. we work closely and have a good relationship with Habitat of Northern Virginia, and they've wanted to work in Arlington for a long time. They've done a few small projects, mostly, only condos, but there was really no way that they could do anything, even with the resources that Habitat for Humanity brings to the situation. And it was a zoning problem. I mean, even if they had a donated plot of land, chances are they wouldn't have been able to do anything with it. And so we need to make some changes to make that possible. So in Arlington, we have actually two different processes going on in the county that are going to have an impact on missing middle housing. The first is that we are going through a comprehensive planning process, not countywide like you guys are doing. That would be amazing. But we are focusing on creating a new land use plan for the Lee Highway corridor, the soon to be renamed Lee Highway corridor. So that replanning process is really seen as a key opportunity to not just talk about the countywide issues and what rules and policies should apply, but to look at a particular area. In this case, it happens to be the wealthier half of our community. It's a corridor that goes through that is predominantly, again, single family homes, and has really been unable to see any development over since our general land use plan was developed in the 60s. And so we're having a lot of conversations about much higher density, but we're, looking at lines on the map to say, here's where higher density areas of opportunity are, but here is also where you can line those higher density areas of opportunity, such as nodes and corridors, with this lower density, but higher density than single family missing middle housing, sort of as a transition into the neighborhood. Again, reflecting on something that Councilmember Jawando said, there's the small missing middle and the large missing middle. We're seeing that corridor lining type of missing middle as the larger missing middle. So it might be maybe 4 stories tall, whereas the type of missing middle that you would have back within the neighborhoods might be a smaller type that is more similar to the size of a single family home. So the second thing that the county is doing is true to form in Arlington. We are taking a very analytical approach, study, and we're doing a missing middle housing study. So not just writing a report. It's a full-blown, community engaged process that's actually going to take probably 2 years by the time it's done. And we're looking at missing middle housing opportunities across the entire county. And so, again, it's not a countywide comprehensive plan like Thrive is, but it's just looking at missing middle housing opportunities. And I think that, so we're looking at design, infrastructure, economics, affordability, all of those things that could help identify what the barriers are and what policy changes we need to make in order to encourage things. I will say that this process had been moving forward anyway for a number of reasons, as I've mentioned. But one thing that's happened over the past year, that increasing focus on racial equity because of last year's events with George Floyd and others, really has sort of lifted up this opportunity by opening people's minds to the racial equity implications of, like I said, breaking through some of those barriers and exclusionary zoning practices in single family neighborhoods. And so we've actually seen, and this was true in Minneapolis when they did this as well, that talking about racial equity is really important when talking about changing zoning patterns around single family. So we have this multi-phase process. First phase is laying the groundwork. Are we all talking the same language? The second phase, which we'll be launching later this year, is a focused study of housing types. So they're literally going to be picking, they're doing a survey right now. What housing types do we as Arlingtonians want to see in our community? Is it duplexes? Is it cottages? Is it more townhomes? Is it triplexes, multiplexes, all that list of missing middle types? As an advocate, my answer is all of them. I want to see all of them. It just depends on where and how. And so we'll see how, you know, how far they take that literally selection of housing types. And then their next question is, okay, we've decided that we want to look at these housing types as a community. The next question is, where is a good place within our community for these to fit? So that's the approach that they're taking. Like I said, I think that it's a long and analytical approach. We as advocates probably would have been interested in a more expeditious approach, but we understand that there is a need to kind of, or at least we understand their perspective, the county's perspective, that there is a need to ease into this. There is a supercharged political context that is, you know, happening in many places, including Arlington. So I think there's a super sensitivity to the potential reactions of those single family homeowners and others that who prefer the status quo. And so the political side of this in Arlington's case is that has caused us to slow things down. Whether that's the right choice remains to be seen. So part of that process, though, is where our organization comes in. We actually are working purely on the public education and engagement side of things, not directly with the county, but under support of a state Virginia Housing Community Impact Grant. We are working with our local Lee Highway Alliance on public education and outreach. We're creating videos, going out to individual community and civic associations, having conversations around what missing middle housing is, trying to sort of attack some of those myths that get put out there about what it is, trying to stay on top of the rumor mill. I don't know if Montgomery County is like Arlington is in terms of Nextdoor, the app Nextdoor being a place where there's a lot of possibility for myths and mistruths to be spread. And so we need to keep that under control. And we have a long way to go. And it feels, like I said, it feels painfully slow to those of us who have been advocating for this for a while. But the hope is that this process will produce a more effective and sustainable reforms that are supported by a broad coalition of community stakeholders. So I'd be glad to talk in the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And now, by process of elimination, I've been so wrong, I've run out of ways to be wrong. So we'll turn to Sarah Reddinger.
Okay, thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. Working for Habitat for Humanity as an affordable homeownership developer, obviously, I'm particularly focused on how missing middle housing can increase access to ownership and wealth building, but also how it can really help to build a more equitable community. As we all know, homeownership is out of reach for so many people in Montgomery County, right? You heard earlier, it's about 30% of the county's land is used for single family detached homes. That's compared to about 2% of land used for multifamily living. So we're really restricting kind of the housing typologies that can be built, also the supply, and driving up costs. So last year alone, I think that the sales price for a single family detached house in the county, the average sales price was $775,000. So our residents are getting priced out of ownership and in turn are unable to live in many of the amenity-rich neighborhoods solely because they can't afford to buy a single family house. And this ownership problem becomes even more concerning, I think, when you look at it through an equity lens. And you saw some of these data points earlier, but in Montgomery County, 75% of white households live in owner-occupied units as compared to 43% of African-American households. That's really just an unacceptable figure. And this homeownership gap has also led to a staggering gap in wealth, where I think nationwide, a typical white family has about 10 times the wealth of a typical Black family. And lack of access to ownership is the biggest hurdle to building generational wealth. And I think one of the ways to address this gap is to increase access to ownership generally to families at all income levels. And so as you've heard, missing middle housing is naturally more affordable than detached single family homes. I think if you're looking at average sales price for an attached home last year in the county, so this is condos, co-ops, and townhomes, that average sales price drops to about $370,000. I think it's clear that smaller attached units on average are less expensive, but we can't actually build them in most of the county. Continuing from an equity perspective, I think it's also important to recognize that single family zoning is exclusionary in nature and was designed to be so. It has been destructive and has served to segregate our neighborhoods by income and by race. It has led to inequitable access to schools and parks and green space and transportation and healthcare and so many other things. And so to truly build equitable and inclusive communities, we have to build communities where everybody can actually live. And this is going to require different housing typologies that meet different budgets and different desires. So like many others, I mean, obviously I recognize that missing middle housing is not going to wholly solve our ownership crisis or any of the equity issues. It's not going to be kind of the be-all solution for the housing crisis that we have. Obviously, we have a lot more to do in terms of addressing discrimination in lending and credit and providing access to financial and credit education. But I think we also need to look at ways to increase access to more deeply affordable units as well. But certainly missing middle, I think, has a role to play in that. And I will say from Habitat's perspective, we are working on a project right now in partnership with the city of Tacoma Park, where we're going to convert a single family home into a duplex. And with the subsidy required to build one single family home on a parcel in Tacoma Park, there's no way we could have been able to do the project. We're looking at a subsidy of probably $500,000 for one unit. But when we have access to the ability to build a duplex, and in this case, we only do because it's zoned R40, which is really rare. But we're looking at a subsidy then per unit of less than $200,000, which is still a lot, but we're used to subsidizing all of our properties at over $100,000, right? So I think the ability to build missing middle housing will not only help to create more attainable market rate housing, but also help our mission-minded nonprofits build more affordable housing in communities across the county.
That's great. Thank you for all of you. That was really a great way to start this off. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to try to get through more than a couple. So I just encourage everybody to keep their answers as succinct as possible. One question I had is, in addition to zoning as such, are there other policy changes that would be helpful, do you think, to facilitating getting some of these things built? And I'll direct that to any of you, but I think some of the things Sarah was saying kind of touch on this. So I'd invite you to keep going with that line of thought if you wanted, Sarah.
Sure. So I think particularly from an ownership perspective, looking at the subdivision process, especially for smaller missing middle units like duplexes and triplexes that are going to be infill in single family neighborhoods is really critical. Obviously, if we're looking to gain, make gains in ownership, we need to make sure that those units can be sold. I think oftentimes we want to be able to sell them fee simple, so sell the property and the land underneath to one owner. And right now, if you're building a duplex on a single family lot and you can't subdivide the land underneath, you've either got a condo structure or you've got somebody owning both units and then renting out the other unit. So I think taking a look at the subdivision process and figuring out how to speed up the timeline and make it less costly as well could play a critical role.
And I'd invite our other panelists to weigh in, and maybe while you're at it, you might also tell us what you think about whether or not these missing middle types of products can in fact be affordable. Sarah was talking about how it reduces the amount of subsidy that's necessary if an affordable housing provider wants to come in and build missing middle housing. But I'd ask our other panelists if they think that it is possible to deliver units that we would consider affordable, that is at or below area median income, I guess might be one way of thinking about it, with duplexes, triplexes, or some other missing middle product in Montgomery County or in other inner ring suburbs in the DC area.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot in talk as we've introduced our proposal, and or as we work through this, it'll be at top of mind. You know, I think, as I alluded to in my comments earlier, there is a benefit, particularly in transit corridors, for just having more density, right? You know, if under transit-oriented development. But if you want, and one of the reasons in my proposal we put forward a form-based approach was that if you wanted to have more units, you would have had to make them smaller, which theoretically will make them more affordable. And this is for that smaller missing middle type. But I think there's other things we can do, you know, around, you know, kind of this, and I know you all at planning are working on, I've talked to Director Wright about this kind of guidebook or design guidelines to help encourage affordability, particularly for some of these smaller sized units, but also make sure that they're viable as far as, you know, being able to be built and sold, and either sold or sold, rented. So I think that's something that we should all have an eye out to. And I think I would say it's probably a mix of things, and I don't have all the answers, but, you know, you want to have, I think affordability should be a part of the conversation. Again, affordability is one of those words, and you just kind of alluded to it in your answer of like, what does that mean and to whom? But I think, you know, if the goal can be to have these be at all different price points, that's going to be, I think, a big part of it.
Michelle, did you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. So on the other policies area, we haven't talked really about parking yet. We know that parking is a major issue. It's one reason that I do think it's important to have a particular focus on missing middle housing in transit-rich areas, walkable areas, because that does help limit the amount of car ownership and parking that's even needed in the first place. And so, you know, if we just change the number of units that are allowed, but we keep the same offsite parking requirements, it's going to end up making it really hard to for a developer to be able to pencil out creating more missing middle housing, or it would, you know, lead to, you know, using a lot of paved, you know, impervious surface driveways and things like that, which is also bad for the environment, which is the opposite of what we want to do. So taking advantage of the street where we can is and reducing the need to have a car in the first place are really important. I agree that, and what others have already talked about is the need for tenant protections is a really important parallel policy discussion that needs to be taking place. So dealing with protections for at-risk folks who are at risk of displacement, whether it be renters or owners. Like Sarah said, the condominium issues, financing condominium and management issues. If we can look forward to a world where we actually have a lot more missing middle housing being developed, depending on the details of how it's built, if it's a fourplex, if all of those units are owned by one entity and rented out, you have very small rental properties, and the management of those, you know, dispersed small rental properties has always been challenging. And so that's something that needs to be looked at. And on the flip side, if they become condominiums, then you have a small condominium association, which can also be challenging. And I know that Montgomery County has kind of a leg up on many other jurisdictions in the region, supporting the condominium associations and such, but that is something that I think will have to be talked about. And then of course, you know, the affordability question, I think comes down to, you know, numbers of units and size. It's not just having a duplex or a townhome that makes something affordable. For instance, in Arlington, we have certain types of sites are already eligible for duplexes, but the sizes that are allowed, so it, you know, it must be on a lot that's at least, I don't know, 8,700 square feet. And it must have 2 parking spaces, and in order to do it, you have to go through this extra drawn out, very expensive process. What you're going to get when you go through that is you're going to get very large, very inexpensive, I mean, very, very expensive duplexes. So you need to make sure that you're not just doing missing middle housing in name, but missing middle housing with the intent of reaching that that attainability target that you're trying to reach. And so, you know, and also really importantly, going beyond duplexes. You know, you're going to be able to achieve, you know, the 2 instead of 1 in terms of housing supply if you've got duplexes. But we really need to be looking for how and where we can incorporate the triplexes, 4plexes, 6plexes. You know, these small multiplexes are a way to leverage that land value even more to be able to create smaller size and hopefully more attainable / affordable units. And then finally, I would say very strong home purchase assistance programs along the lines of what Habitat works with. We can't just assume that the market's going to be able to make things affordable, because it doesn't do that for rental housing either. So we need to provide proper supports.
So I'm curious as to if any of you are aware of or have encountered other jurisdictions that have been successful in actually catalyzing construction of more missing middle, everything from duplexes ready to use on up. I mean, you know, Minneapolis got a lot of attention a couple of years ago, supposedly ending single family zoning, but from what I've read, hasn't produced many new missing middle projects. On the other hand, I've read recently that LA has a phenomenal number of, you know, small scale multifamily missing middle type projects getting going. I'm wondering if you could share your experience or what you've heard about in other jurisdictions, that which places have seen some success in actually making things happen, which ones haven't, despite, you know, trying to take some steps, and what can we learn from those experiences in the DC area or elsewhere?
Yeah, I can just add, I have several friends who are on the Minneapolis City Council, and I've talked to them about this when we were looking at our ZTA, and you're right, I think a very small number. It's just a reminder that, you know, there's always this tension in housing production of, you know, what will be most, you know, we're in a capitalist society, right? So what will be most profitable, and how do you make it incentivize and or figure out the market in such a way that these things can be produced? And I think, you know, something like LA, you know, one of the reasons I decided to focus on transit corridors is because I think, you know, and Michelle kind of mentioned this, you know, in areas where you have some more flexibility, where you can justifiably, you know, we reduce the parking in half in our ZTA. I know that some saying remove it completely. You know, you can talk about what the right lever is, or the right you know, kind of level rather is, but you have some flexibility where, you know, there's going to be built-in demand. The land value is going to be high. There's going to be people that want to live there, and you know, it could maybe allow us to experiment in some ways. But no, I think that's a really important question of, and I know that's why we've convened groups of small builders to try to find out what really works. And, you know, and I always think, you know, competition helps, you know, because in bringing out ideas from other places, not even just in our country, but in other places of the world where people have done this. And we've been looking at that, as I know you all have too, but that is a big question as we head into this debate. What will actually incentivize or create the conditions where it can happen? And I think that's an important point. So I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists as well.
Yeah, you've talked about parking. I guess one of my pet theories is that parking plus by right standards are the two key components. Am I right about that, or wrong, or are there other things that maybe we haven't mentioned yet that are stumbling blocks where reducing some regulatory barriers maybe, you know, is necessary but not sufficient to start getting things to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think by right zoning for missing middle housing is absolutely critical. And from talking with the Habitat affiliate in Minneapolis, I know that they and other housing advocates are really taking a look at the development standards. So taking a look at lot size, floor area ratios, setbacks, height requirements, because a lot of those were not changed and have become real hurdles. And they think those are kind of the main hurdles in terms of developing more missing middle. And they're also pushing for development standard incentives and bonuses for building affordable units, which I think could be a really interesting thing to take a look at in Montgomery County to help make some of those missing middle units more affordable.
Yeah, that Sarah mentioned several things that I was going to mention too, which is this interesting, I'll call it still in a pilot phase in several communities where they are using some incentives and density bonuses, for instance, to allow, say, 6 units instead of 4 if a certain number of them are affordable to certain standards, things like that. I think that many of these initiatives are so new that it is hard to know what's working yet. But the good news is that there are dozens and dozens of communities working on this right now across the country. So it's not just the ones that you've heard of in the big press releases and the big stories like Minneapolis and in California. There's dozens of communities working on this in Washington State, in Portland, in Cincinnati, St. Petersburg, Florida is doing skinny houses, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oops, Michelle, I think you muted yourself.
Yep, somebody muted me. Okay, there's 100% overlay, affordable housing overlay in Cambridge. North Carolina. I mean, this is not limited to the sexy sort of articles in the Atlantic. This is happening all over the place, and I think we're going to see a lot of progress over the next few years as we all try to figure out how to make it work right.
And one of the, Casey, if I could real quick before we, I just wanted to mention, I'm glad you mentioned all those other cities, because you're right, it is happening in other places. And also, we had, there was a little tucked away article recently, I think I shared it and a couple other people shared it, about the Biden administration incentivizing this type of relaxation of single family zoning. And if as part of this infrastructure bill plan. And so that could be yet another thing, a financial or otherwise incentive to localities to do this. But again, we have to do the right things that will incentivize the market. But I think there's things that can happen at multiple levels of government. I just wanted to raise that.
Just picking up a couple of questions from the chat. Somebody had asked, what are the next steps in adoption and implementation of Thrive 2050? The answer is our county council, including Councilmember Jawando, will be listening to testimony basically late June, mid to late June. And then the committee on which he serves, Planning, Housing, and Economic Development, will be taking it up, I believe, before their summer break for August. And I think we expect them to have it ready for the full council action by sometime in the early fall. So it's absolutely essential that any folks who are listening who are interested in this, and obviously we hope you'll be supportive of it, but if you're interested in it for any reason or in any way, shape, or form and want to take any position, you need to let our county council members know what you think and why. And I think you can do that by sending them an email or signing up to testify. They just opened up another evening of public hearings. I'm not sure if that's filled up yet. The first one filled up almost in minutes of when the signups opened up. So there's a lot of interest in this. And really, to be perfectly direct about it, there's been a ton of misinformation about this. And I think that's not just true in Montgomery County. There's always naturally going to be a lot of apprehension about any kind of change in land use of this kind. So it's important that folks in this conference who are extremely immersed, a lot of experts here, I think that our electeds really would benefit from hearing from all of you about your thoughts on what this is all about, why it's important, and what are the things you think it would take to make it a reality. I want to give Councilmember Jawando just a chance to talk about the process to wrap it up and what he thinks would be most helpful, not just on Thrive, but on the progress of his 2 bills. And then I think we'll wrap it up.
Great, appreciate it. Yeah, you laid out the public hearing schedule, and maybe if I could use while I'm talking here, maybe Jason or somebody can plop that link in the chat for people that don't have it to the council's public hearing. That's certainly going to be an important part of it. And then we will be considering thrive in the committee. We'll also be bringing up, we had asked I introduced the bill, the ZTA and the anti-rent gouging bill way back, a while ago, but we held back on considering them so that Thrive could catch up and we could consider everything together. And so I think this is the exact right time. As has been happening, we've been hearing from people continually. I do think there is some, just like with any change, I work on a lot of things where we're trying to change things, whether it be reimagining public safety or changing zoning. People are scared about the unknown. And I think this is a topic where it is interwoven with all of that fear and human predisposition to be against change. And I think the thing about this is, though, that we used to do this. And I know Gwen Wright brings this up a lot. We had this type of housing in the past, as the charts that were shown. So I think we do need to hear from folks, and also know that as the author of those ETA on this specific topic, and there's other colleagues that are interested in it, we are very interested in getting, hearing from everybody and designing and passing things that are kind of reflective of the input we get, and that also are going to achieve the results that we want. And so I think the input is not only needed, it's wanted. And so I appreciate you allowing me to do that. And I can be emailed. You can email the council. I'm just councilmember.jawando@montgomerycountymd.gov. You can sign up to testify. You can email me and my colleagues. We'll be considering this very carefully over the next several months. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. And thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Councilmember Jawando, and thanks to Michelle and Sarah for helping us deliver a great panel. We're only 2 minutes over, which at a conference like this is running ahead of schedule. I think that's my experience anyway. If you're only 2 minutes late, you're way ahead.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. That was great. Appreciate your
Thank you all.
participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.